Welcome to the second part of our third session on traditional copywriting. This part of the lecture acts like a writing bootcamp, where I'll give you some basic tools to finesse your copywriting. I'll also touch on the various mediums we produce branding copy for. Okay, so let's get started. In this part of the lecture, you'll explore the process of creative thinking for innovation and conceiving the big ideas for your branding messages. Again, it's all about making the connection between the big idea, as covered in the branding unit, and the branding copy you produce to convey your big idea effectively. If you've been doing the reading in the reading room, you should have an additional and solid grounding about this connection. You'll also explore how to determine strategic marketing positioning, target demographics, media vehicles, and how to translate these into creative copy. Again, this expands on the topic as covered in the branding unit and in the previous sessions of this unit. You'll also further develop your knowledge of fundamental brand writing skills. On the screen, you'll see some general things to avoid in your copywriting. The first one is complicated tenses, especially what are called conditional and passive tenses. This is an English course, it's not English 101, so I'll go over these quite succinctly. Conditional sentences typically begin with the word if. Some classic examples are, if I have enough money, I will go to Japan. Or another variation is, if I had enough money, I would go to Japan. And a third tense variation would go something like, if I had had enough money, I would have gone to Japan. Those were all examples of conditional sentences, and they're things to be avoided. In a passive voice sentence, an action doesn't actually do something. Instead, something is done to it. Here are some examples of passive sentences. The cake was eaten by the dog. Instead, an active sentence would have said, the dog ate the cake. I'll go over that because I know that there's a bit of a subtle difference there, but it's quite important to understand. So a classic example of a passive sentence would be, the cake was eaten by the dog. Instead, we need to use something much more active, the dog ate the cake. So something did something, rather than something was done to something. Another example would be, the students are taught by the teacher. Instead, we should say something like, the teacher teaches the student. Chances are, if your sentence has the words by the in it, followed by a noun, you have a passive sentence. Also, we need to write something as we feel it should be said, then try to convert it into simple, declarative language. Once you've actually done that, you may find that you're left with something very boring. If so, it can only be because the content itself is kind of boring. So my advice would be to start again and say something interesting. Okay, so I've covered conditional sentences, I've covered passive sentences. Next up, complicated constructions. And by that I mean you embed clauses. By that, clauses are kind of sentences within sentences. Embedded clauses aren't necessarily against the rules, but even a slightly complex piece of embedding is probably better off as two separate sentences. Again, write it as you feel it should be said, then try breaking it into simpler components if necessary. Read your text out loud, just as if you were speaking it to a person. If you struggle for breath reading a sentence, you probably have a compound or a complicated sentence. Break that sentence down into two or more simpler sentences. The challenging thing is not forgetting about the rhythm of the text, as we've gone over previously. And this, just like conditional and just like passive voice sentences, it's an important thing to get your head around, especially if you're going to be writing English for an international audience. If you have an international audience, the chances are English obviously is going to be their second language. They're going to rely on things like Google Translate to translate your page into their native language, and things like passive sentences and compound sentences and complicated constructions don't translate very well. whereas simple sentences are very easy to translate even on a robotic system like Google Translate. And you can further ensure that the meaning that you mean to convey is going to remain intact once that sentence that you've written is translated into another language. Next up are cliches. Cliches are phrases people have heard many, many times before. And why say something that's been said before? There may be exceptions to the rule. A cliche may be poetic or apposite, have fallen into disuse, or it may have some special kind of character. It may also introduce a note of familiarity into a difficult subject. But don't worry. Fair or unfair, kill as many cliches as you can. They are not an endangered species. So what are some hallmark cliches? Things like a night to remember, family entertainment, go for a spin. Up and down the country at this moment in time, the winds of change are blowing. Cliches are everywhere, and it's a good idea to kill as many of them as you can. It's always nicer to hear something you haven't really heard before. If you can't say something without a cliche, there must be something wrong with what you're trying to say. Cliches can, of course, be legitimately subverted. I mention this because so many people use subverted cliches when writing newspaper or newsletter headlines, that it would be inhumane to imply this was a bad practice, but just tread warily. As with puns, subverted or cleverly modified cliches are usually just poor jokes. And then there's the mini-cliches. Mini-cliches are inevitable. They're simply small phrases of no particular distinction, but so useful that they're generally overused. So some examples of this would be, on my way. As a matter of fact, here goes. But compare these sentences. The very occasional minor cliché can give a comfortable quality to a sharp, innovative piece of writing, but any more and it reads like mud. I'm going to repeat that sentence because there's going to be a variation that follows. The very occasional minor cliché can give a comfortable quality to a sharp, innovative piece of writing, but any more and it reads like mud. Instead, we can say that one or two minor cliches can give a comfortable quality to take the edge off sharp, innovative piece of writing, but any more and before you know it, it reads like mud. The first sentence is clear of these mini-cliches. The second actually has three. Those are the mini-cliche 102. Sounds a bit comfy. The mini-cliche take the edge off. Well, it's a bit wet. It doesn't really do anything. And the third one, before you know it, well, that's just pure stodge. Okay, some more writing no-nos. The only reason for including a long or little-known word should be where absolute precision of meaning is vital. If your audience doesn't know the word, then what's the point of being precise about the meaning? It's surprising how long words cumulatively spoil the apparent simplicity of a sentence, or even the timing and delivery of a line of dialogue. So try to adopt this habit. Every time you come across a long or fancy word in your writing, spend about 15 to 30 seconds searching your brain for a one-syllable version. For example, even when I used the phrase, the very occasional minor cliché, a moment's thought could have shortened it down to the odd minor cliché. Words ending in ing, or ing words. Ing words are bad. They're not very bad, but it's worth it just to keep an eye on them. That one syllable they add to a word combines with an extra layer of complexity that usually, well, it makes them a valid target for deletion. Try to use active, exciting words. It's another way of passing more information in a short sentence. It's not that words like went or cut are that boring, but it misses the opportunity to say much more about how a person went about going or cutting. So words like slid, bounced, waddled, jetted, well, they just tell you more about how that person went. And words like hack, dissect, bite, saw, tell you more about an action than merely cut. By putting information in your writing this way, you may be able to leave it out elsewhere. Tony Anton, in his book The Great Print Advertising, well, he has a really good tip for headlines, which is to arrange your line so that the most interesting words appear at the beginning. This isn't, however, an excuse for floweriness, which brings us to avoid showing off your writing talent. What you say should be so interesting that the reader, or viewer, or listener isn't even aware of the cleverness of the writer. It's true of the most great brand copy. Flowery or overwritten brand copy, especially TV adverts, are particularly bad if they're like ads intended for frequent repetition. Another thing to avoid is showing off your knowledge. This is possibly even a more serious crime, at least in advertising. There are ways of demonstrating your knowledge without sounding as though you're showing off about it. It's a very fine distinction there. Any display of knowledge, other than that of the product, accidentally or otherwise, is undesirable. Even using words like obviously indicate that what follows is obvious to the writer when it may not be necessarily obvious to the reader. At the other end of the scale, a lapse into the mannered use of Latin or French is the worst kind of pomposity in an advertisement, and should only be considered if your target market wears something like a crown or bishop's robes. Following these 10 rules will vastly improve your copy, especially if you're producing it for online audiences. Why? The less rubbish we put into our copy, the less complicated our sentences are. It makes our copy much more accessible to international audiences as well. We've all toyed, as I said, with Google Translate or similar free online language translators, and I'm pretty sure you can think of some hilarious translations. Chances are that the poor translator is really struggling with cliches that it just doesn't understand, or complex sentences, or jargon, or kind of other copywriting nasties. Clean and clear sentences, even the occasional long one, makes copy easy to translate into another language. Try it for yourself. Take a really complicated English language sentence you've written or even seen online, copy it, and pop it into the Google Translate and translate it into another language. Let's go with Italian. Copy that Italian translation back into the translation box and then translate it into English. Yeah, you'll see what I mean. How much of that original meaning in that complicated or cliche-ridden or jargon-stuffed sentence remained intact? Now do the same thing with a clean and clear sentence. Notice the difference in terms of results? Right, so we've covered some basic things that you shouldn't do when it comes to copywriting, so let's look at some things that you should be doing. Most people have writing habits that show up in the use of certain words and phrases. They're almost like written fingerprints. These words and phrases are, well, they're likely to be perfectly acceptable in themselves, but may be evidence of a personal style that's not exactly effective. From the audience's point of view, and there really is no other view when it comes to copywriting, the copywriter, him or herself, simply doesn't exist. The brand copy is a communication between the audience and the company or service concerned. Some of the great creatives do have personal styles, and these styles that, they meld with that of the companies or services they become most associated with. But that is a genuine relationship, where they become the voice of a company in the same way as does that company's CEO or managing director. And I'll explain that with an example. Richard Branson has his own unique voice for Virgin. Alan Sugar has his own voice and style for his companies, as does Marjorie Scardino of Pearson and David Geffen for Geffen Records. The copywriters who produce copy for those businesses write as if they were that person. We don't try to improve upon their style, nor do we try to overimpose our own personal style over theirs. Our writing style has to reflect the nature, the culture, the kind of persona and character of either the company, the product, or the service that we're producing copy for. Now, if you're producing copy for a brand that you own, this is an important consideration that you'll have to grapple with. What will your style and your voice and your company's voice be? So let's look at something like words and sentences. The emphasis here is that actions speak louder than words. See your job not as a writer of words, but also as an avoider of words. Adopt the habit of chopping something out completely if it isn't working, not as your last resort, but actually as your first. Even if it is working, try cutting it out. It still may, it may improve things. People don't wait for a full stop when reading. If they're bored, they'll turn the page, surf off to another website, or flip channels after a few words. Get to the point. Once you've made it, finish, or make another point. Kill your babies is a well-known saying, apparently in writing circles. It's something that I've heard for decades, basically for as long as I have been copywriting. The idea is, basically, if you find that you're personally in love with a joke, or a word, or a line, if you're personally in love with it, a warning bell should be going off in your head, and it should be saying cut it out and replace it with something better. Or just leave a hole or a gap. Maybe the joke, the word, the line was implied anyway. Maybe it changes the tone of the piece too much. It's strange, but it works, if only because it forces you to be hypercritical. All of the words that remain in a bit of branding copy should be as concrete as possible. It's just simpler to read about dogs, cats, plants, cheese, socks, and the world of solid things than it is to read about anything abstract, subtle, or convoluted. Remember the slippery slide at all times. Next up is mistakes. Just don't make them. Don't make them at all. Get used to rereading what you've written purely for grammar and punctuation. Check spelling with patience. And there are plenty of really good, free online services or even bits of software that you can download that can do that for you, that will assess your grammar, your punctuation, your spelling. Use them. They should become your best friends. And it's worth remembering that sometimes any word can look odd. Don't be too proud to look it up or ask someone where a comma goes. You can take certain liberties with grammar where there are positive benefits for comprehension. Advertising has championed the verbless sentence, like this one. To the purist, they represent what's wrong with branding copy, but all these liberties, they're only taken in the interest of reader-friendliness. You mustn't think they're mandatory. Don't break the rules of grammar just for the sake of it, or even worse, to make something read like an ad. People often start writing copy by mimicking brand copy they've read before, or churn out verbless sentences, subject-less sentences, or sentences beginning with and or because. It can be horrific. In comparison, it's far better to be a purist. If you feel it's lowering your high writing standards to break rules, then simply just don't do it. Grammatical writing doesn't have to be dull. After all, the rules of grammar are there for reader friendliness in the first place. Don't forget that people read far faster than you write, so what you write as a deftly phrased, 3-word, verbless sentence can completely lose its meaning when read at full tilt. The guarantee of a grammatical sentence is that it is self-contained, so your reader needn't wonder what part of the previous sentence it refers to. If you do employ a little grammar perversion, make sure you reread it several times, coming at it cold as often as possible, so that you know it doesn't trip up your reader. And you'll find more about this subject, passive sentences, compound sentences, contractions, writing style, grammar, and all the rest of it in the reading room. There are many, many other words to avoid than those shown on this screen. However, these are a good place to start. Avoid them. Never use them. If they or anything like them appear in your copy, kill them. They add nothing, basically. Think of them as cheap baubles that make your copy look, well, cheap and even uninspired. If you want to convey quality, do so in your copy, the layout that you use, and the images that you use. Let the copy convince your audience that your brand is indeed a quality brand. Don't demand that your audience look at something. They'll look at it if they want to. Make that slide slippery, and they will. Never command an audience to do anything, not even to buy something. Remember, we always invite. It's up to the audience to determine value, and that's something we need to convince them of in the copy that we produce. Phrases like second to none, and phrases that are like it, they're just cheap cliches. Avoid them like the plague. You can probably figure out why the other words in this list, and words or phrases like them, undermine brand copy. This is the part of the lecture where we're going to be covering, in very broad strokes, the different kind of medium that you're going to be producing copy for. And by medium, I mean things like the internet, radio, print, newsletter, TV, those sorts of things. Each has its own kind of precise reason for existing in terms of copywriting, and because each medium has a specific function, as it were, especially in terms of presenting a brand to an audience, it may mean some slight tweaking to the emphasis within the copy that you produce. Radio is a medium in which the general immersion you experience as a listener, whether it's in the car or in the lift or in a waiting room or reception or wherever, it can actually be harmful to the appreciation of conveying a branding message or that brand messaging possibility. There's just a great temptation to add to the noise with just more of the same. And by that I mean there's such a boring format to radio advertising. Now this is something that's much more difficult to address than, say, brand copy for the press. With radio, there's just a sameness of delivery across a myriad of radio stations, which is even more pronounced when you limit yourself to just comparing the commercials on these different stations. Just more voices ranting about products with more catchy music. You need to find sounds that can stand for your product and service, and do that alone, wherever on the wavebands they're actually heard. For the writer, perhaps the worst thing you can do is to write too much for radio. Unless it's an announcement of national importance, they really just won't care. It's far better to hack back on words mercilessly. Be honest when you time your script. If you really can't read it slowly in your allotted time, cut it until you can. When it comes to cutting, leave only the kernel of what you actually want to say. If the kernel isn't interesting enough, then ditch it. Radio is strangely intimate. If you're whispering in people's ears, simple things work better than bragging rambles or convoluted situational comedy. Create silences or surprising sound textures. Short, simple lines allow the speaker to give just the right performance because they allow for pauses and scope for more character in the intonation. Of all the mediums we'll actually cover, radio is actually the most natural form of communication. If you want to tell your friends something, you don't send them a 48-sheet poster. You ring them up and tell him orally. Think of ideas that use the fact that you can hear but not see. Carling Black Label produced an excellent radio commercial in which a man is told to empty his pockets in a police station. There followed 20 seconds of sound effects as metal objects, beds, crockery, etc. fell out onto the desk. After a pause, the policeman says, "Come on," and the other one. The noises start again as another policeman says, "I bet he drinks Carling Black Label." The idea could only work on radio, and has the other virtue of having more sound effects than words. Remember to treat the production of a radio ad seriously. Don't skip research. Cast it thoroughly and invest your characters with believable personalities. Don't always use humor. Try touching a nerve. Integrate the product skillfully, or make it integral to the idea so it doesn't blow the whole tone when it turns up. Posters are the copywriting purist's branding medium. Placed out in the real world, with room for minimal text, it's a great medium to use in very original ways. For example, there was a poster for budgie food in South America, and it was covered in birds all day because the agency had placed some sort of bird food on a ledge underneath the poster. I believe it was a very effective thing to do. Now, you may be forgiven for thinking that posters really don't need research as a medium. And broadly speaking, it's true that you don't really need to go out and see what a poster site looks like before putting pen to paper, because you basically pass posters every single day. Nevertheless, once or twice while you're walking along a street, it's worth stopping and looking at a poster site with a fresh pair of eyes. Look how people walk past the craziest, brightest colored poster site as if it weren't even there. People are hardly likely to write to the Times reporting an unusual colored, huge immensity of a poster site by the side of a road in their town. Advertising is no longer a new phenomenon. Look at the photographs of Victorian London. Every surface seems to be covered with advertising hoardings. The advertisements themselves make outrageous claims for ridiculous waxes, potions, and all manner of brass implements. Yet, even 100 years ago, no one in the pictures actually looks up in astonishment, much less has to struggle for control over their horses. It was actually just commonplace and everyday, even then. Posters also have a special quality through being visible not just to your own target market, but to everyone. They can spread your appeal at the same time as talking to your current users. Press copy, to some copywriters, is very special. It's a branding messaging craft that isn't briefed out to an illustrator, photographer, or director in order to be realized, but which uses the copywriter's own talents directly onto the page. The special nature of the press is partly due to the perfect platform a newspaper offers for things like intelligent communication of product information, or the ultimate presentation of campaigning arguments, and partly because so many great copywriters have already set and established the standards. It's an area where less isn't always more. Very occasionally, long copy is permissible. For example, to some readers, 5,000 words on the quality of Jamaican Blue Hill coffee may be strangely fascinating, where 25 words may not necessarily be. It's interesting to think that there could actually be undiscovered depths to coffee. In comparison, a coffee ad supporting only 25 words will confirm your worst suspicions. Long copy press opportunities are sadly rare. They depend on a confluence of circumstances. The people with enough money to pay for such an ad are rarely the ones whose product would merit 5,000 words. It's one of life's more irritating kind of ironies. Computers, banks, and cars frequently use the press, but don't always have enough to say that will fascinate. The opportunities do still exist, however, and their rarity does contribute to a sense of event when a long copy press ad actually does appear. Another caveat to bear in mind is this. Just because your Independent or Daily Telegraph doesn't seem to have changed much in 50 years, the world, and therefore the reader, actually has. They have far more demands on their attention than ever before, and even if they are attracted by your ad through its brilliant, intelligence, simplicity, they're not necessarily disposed to read your copy by way of rewarding you. Any rewards going should be in favor of the reader. They're driving down the motorway of their day. You must entice them off onto your little dirt track with few, very enticing opening words. And if you don't keep the reward or the promise of the reward going throughout the copy, they'll be back on the motorway without a backward glance, as they're quite prepared to quit in mid-sentence if necessary. Particularly, as elsewhere in the newspaper, perhaps even on the same page, there's a world war developing. So what are we supposed to do? You're aiming for flow. One idea should flow into the next as if it were the most natural thing. Intense writing and rewriting achieves this. Flesh it out, cut it back, flesh it out again, cut it back again. Change the order of the points several times. Find out what works best. Find a central thread. Be prepared to abandon everything if another central thread actually occurs to you. Hack out the cliches. Straighten out the complex sentences. Make sure ideas still flow naturally into one another. And do things like chopping out your favorite gag, perhaps. Do it all, mix, and serve. If the reading snags anywhere, iron out the offending sentence, then read it again. There should be no point at which the reader is actually put off. Again, Adrian Holmes advocates a very simple method. Before starting your copy, work out where it will end. Creating the flow of logic is similar to the job of erecting a telephone line from point A to point B, in that you can't very well put the wire up without the poles. One novelist said he disciplined himself by thinking, as he sat down to write, of being on a stage in front of hundreds of people just as the doors to the bar were opening at the back of the hall. His job was to keep everyone in their seats just by his words alone. If you have mental discipline like this, you shouldn't need many rules. You'd use them anyway in order to achieve the effect that you want, but it's a good comparison to keep in mind. To achieve or enhance the flow of your copy, as I've just described, it may help to think of it as a linking process. And again, this goes back to the slippery slide. The first line of copy should make you want to read the second. The second line should pick up a word or idea from the first and lob it sweetly into the third sentence. The third sentence should continue the process, and the process itself shouldn't become mechanical, and it definitely shouldn't read as though it's mechanical. An easy way to link is to use linking words or phrases. Conventional wisdom says the average reading level is that of a 12-year-old. This includes reading comprehension. It's a pretty good rule to keep in mind, and it's okay to aim for a reading age of 12, but it shouldn't mean your copy reads as though it was written by a 12-year-old. Nor should you write as if you have a gun to your head. Just relax. Be prepared to throw in an aside. Use brackets and appropriate quotes if need be, but be original. Remember the wit of eschew surplus. Exemplify the content of your message through its form, and don't be overly formal. In written materials, speech mannerisms can be, well, actually quite refreshing. Humor should always be used sparingly and well. When it's appropriate, your copy can be funny, or wry, or dry, or whatever is appropriate. It's something the British brand copy and advertising does exceedingly well. It's our way of presenting our national neuroses in an acceptable, accessible, attention-catching, and effective way. A kind of nudge-nudge, wink-wink. It's worth remembering that brand messages, particularly advertising, is just another cry for attention to an audience. Humor often works because it gets over this barrier. If nothing else, it's an instant reward for reading, watching, or listening to the ad. But this has to be judged correctly, so by all means do use humor, so long as it's used in the right place. There's also one more caveat. Make sure you're really as funny as you think you are. If you're not sure, try this simple test. When you give the copy to someone else to read, they laugh, or at least they'll smile. If people don't laugh or smile, you can't really be sure what you've written is funny, and you need to be. It may still be funny if nobody laughs. It may be a wry kind of humor, for instance. On the other hand, it may be pathetic, but you just can't tell. But if they do laugh, then it is funny. Don't put too many funny lines in any one piece of copy. That can tend to read as kind of a desperate bid for approval. If anyone is reading, a big if, remember, they'll be reading because they're genuinely interested in your facts. Generally, avoid puns. The few good ones don't really justify the misery caused by all the rest. Puns are much misunderstood, and usually best left to the Sun newspaper or News of the World. And those references should kind of tell you something about puns. The trouble is that the word pun suggests kind of a small-minded play on words for the simple reason that most puns are. But really, the area of wordplay is far richer. Puns go from awful down to the absolute worst, but they always go upwards into an area where puns aren't jokes, but a way of contracting a lot of information into a very few words. For instance, labor isn't working. Labor isn't working is arguably this country's most famous poster, used in the 1979 to help the UK Conservative Party to power for another 18-year stay. It's wheeled out at every election for one excuse or another. It's accompanied by a picture of a dole queue. The headline means the country's workforce has nothing to do, but it's a pun. And it's not an awful one because the Labour Party obviously chose the word labour to reflect the interests of the workforce. It's a pointed way of saying that Labour was failing at the very thing it stood for. Or at least the agency who produced it. That's what their thinking was. And on the basis of that, even if you liked Labour, what remaining point was there in voting for them? It's a pun that actually changed history. Truly, this success of this example of a pun is exceedingly rare, like a black rhino. Students have challenged me to name an equally successful advertising pun that achieved anywhere near the same results as labor isn't working, and to this day, I can't. As Sugarman says, perhaps because the word pun suggests puny. That Conservative Party poster was anything but puny. Now, while I may be emphasizing things like style and flow, it is worth remembering that all this style and flow is actually secondary to the information. Don't throw out a fact for a piece of flow. Ideally, flow really isn't about the elegant linking phrases. It's about finding the natural flow of your information. If it's created only with linking words and the like, you'll find the end result strangely artificial. When it's an apparently natural flow of ideas, the effect is more persuasive, and it reads less like a salesperson's patter. While I'm on this subject, I should pass on one of the best copywriting tips ever devised. It's from a chap called David Abbott, who said that he often checked how convincing his copy was by reading it out loud in a corny American voice. If the sense survived this kind of treatment, it maybe had a chance of persuading readers. In reality, a long piece of copy is just a sales spiel, as hard and as mercenary as any other sales spiel, regardless of the aura of old-school craftsmanship that actually surrounds it. The only difference is that without a salesperson present, the ever-present grin has to be represented in the copy by a certain stylistic charm. When you can get the flow of information right, it seems perfectly obvious, but you have to work hard in order to achieve it. If it reads easy, it wrote hard. Experiment with the order of your points over and over again, until it suddenly looks as though you wrote it just off the top of your head. Give your copy an engine. Copy should have an overall shape. And it's not a bad habit to end a piece by returning in some elegant way to the opening thought. It's good if your opening isn't obvious in the way it's expressed. Maybe a short sentence of only 3 to 8 words. Or how about a question? Better still, if the subject allows, try to take the opening concept or idea right through to the end. All branding copy should dominate wherever it appears. The worst crime for any copywriter is to have our copy passed over, or in other words, ignored. Take a few moments to look at the print advertisements that follows this screen. Each, in its own way and manner, perfectly encapsulates the points made over the past few sessions. And with this session in mind, think about the flow and the linking style of information, the sentence length variations, and their rhythms. Think about that slippery slide, the layouts used, and the visuals provided. New media. We've all heard this term, but what exactly is it? Well, Wikipedia defines new media like this. New media refers to on-demand access to content anytime, anywhere, on any digital device, as well as interactive user feedback and creative participation. And for me, it's as good a definition as any other, so I'm going to basically go with that one. It's worth keeping in mind there are two kinds of new media. There are those that are old media that have gained more currency or power through new technology, or they've just become more fashionable by means of better usage or improved technology. Then there's forms of media that are entirely new. An example of old media enhanced by new technology would be things like televisions that entertain us as we wait in bank queues or post office queues with tailored content. There's also bus stop ad shop posters that can actually talk to you, beam information to your mobile, or even change themselves at night. The improvement in the mechanics of how the ability of a bus stop advert to talk really does give you some outrageous and really innovative creative opportunities. For example, the art director Richard Evans took advantage of this new technology to create a poster for the Sci-Fi Channel in which disembodied voices struck up really banal conversations at bus stops. And it forced those waiting for a bus to take a sudden interest in this ad shop poster that was next to them, which incidentally was advertising the movie The Invisible Man. With the possible exception of the technology that allows information to be beamed to your phone, these new applications or new facilities of pre-existing media kind of work in the same way as the old media. They're very self-contained. The second category, media the likes of which we've never seen before, is a set of disparate media that, well, they have an astonishing potential because the technology on which they're based, it's not the sort that addresses you from afar, but in and of itself, it's communicative. It's best exemplified with what we've come to term as being viral. There is no standard way to run viral campaigns, and I'm sorry for all those bloggers with their 5 bullet points on how to make content viral. I'm going to disagree with you there, and I'm going to stress it again. There is no standard way to run viral campaigns. Often, they just happen. Someone shoots some film that goes beyond the usual bounds of taste, and TV advertising censorship laws. It's posted on the internet or emailed to a group of friends. People talk about it, gather around each other's computers with hands over their mouths, then peel away saying, "Send it to me, email it to me." The impact of new media on the writing process is notable for the unprecedented speed and spread of its influence. Today's writers wield the power to write, rewrite, edit, and publish in a matter of seconds. A few keystrokes later, your readers are writing right back to you. As a result, a steady stream of new writing floods this new media landscape, driving all types of content, spawning new vernaculars, and redefining our standards of readability. This is pretty significant, and if you're considering putting a little viral campaign into your mix, there is no rate card. You've heard the expression, the media is the message. This second form of new media exemplifies a new principle, that the message is the media. You can't take your sweet little commercial with your pack shot at the end and expect it to be broadcast around the world. A good little motto from Sugarman is, don't write words, write events. And this is exactly how to approach viral content, and we'll be going into this much more and in far greater detail in the content marketing unit. The medium you choose may not be the medium you end up in. If the rise of new media has changed anything, it has created more opportunities for exceptional writers to excel. And that's because a skilled writer is and has always been a skilled storyteller. And that's something we will all want around for many decades, many client dinners, and as many new media formats to come. We'll be looking at very specific aspects of new media when we cover blogging, content marketing, websites, and social media. Copywriting rules are weaker in the area of TV advertising, just because of the value of originality. I'm going to include online videos in this category, as more and more companies are actually specifically shooting video adverts specifically for YouTube and sites like YouTube. Develop can actually produce an end product that looks really fresh and attracts the attention, albeit in the way that a car crash does. The only downside may be its effect on your reputation. If you wish to make a career out of cool mastery of TV as a medium, it may be wise to keep to the general rules expressed earlier, those of simplicity, of relevance, of knowing who you're talking to, and so on, all those myriad of rules that we spent a lot of time covering. Television is also a very naked medium for your mistakes, so I would recommend spending as long on your script as possible. Make sure you really have made the ideas simple, that any dialogue really is natural. It'll show up horribly if your script just isn't up to it. The good news is that you're rarely alone when you make TV commercials. Be prepared to listen and make judicious choices of people that you're working with if you're producing copy for a television advert. The most valuable one to get right is often the director. Find one who knows about advertising ideas, and you're in good hands. Beyond this, accumulate as much TV experience as you can, because it's not only valuable, but it's also enjoyable. The only rule that may be of any value in the area of TV advertising is this: don't underestimate what it can achieve. Some say that all the great brands are created on television, though as we've seen, new media can be pretty good too. The point is that television is the most powerful weapon in the branding armory, so it's a shame to waste it on mediocrity. This session has invited you to be brutally honest in your pursuit of simple communication and in understanding the nature of various media. Both ask that you supplant your kind of lay view of advertising, if that's what you have, with a professional one. The conventional way to do this is through experience. You need to start producing work of quality on day one, and to do that, you have to want it very much, which is why this study unit exists and why we're delving into it so intensively. If you see a brief or project as being a minor thing not worthy of your attention, or not worthy of the full treatment of all the research and hours of rewrites, it self-evidently ends up as a minor piece of work. Understand the possibilities. The moral is, don't envision things turning out dull and boring. Don't defeat yourself by saying you don't have writing talent or experience for this. Improve your own standards by competing with rival writers in your office, with the work of the best in the industry, or even just with yourself. When you've done something good, stop feeling proud and ask yourself if it's better than the best around. Good ideas are usually produced between people, so working with others, if you get that possibility. If you can't create with someone else, at least bounce your ideas off of other people, and don't get annoyed with them if they don't react the way that you want them to. If their faces don't actually light up with joy and comprehension, you perhaps haven't produced the best work possible. Or perhaps maybe it isn't possible to be the best within the restrictions of a brief. If that's the case, redefine the brief in your head so that the restrictions give you some sort of new idea of what the best could be. Don't expect miracles. Rarely are the first ideas the best. Remember about that whole incubation process. If you're uncertain about an idea, leave it overnight and see what you think when you come to it fresh in the morning. If you're still uncertain in the morning, it's probably not such a great idea. It's amazing how dumb a great line can become between 6 o'clock in the evening and 9 o'clock the following morning. In the meantime, write more. It will be obvious when you've found a good idea from the reaction of others. Your own worst enemy will tell you it's good, and it will be more miserable than you could have ever wished. The right idea, however, is irresistible. It's worth it. If you spend 40 hours producing hundreds of ideas and another 40 hours crafting and honing the one best idea, the fact that the end product is brilliant should come as no surprise to you. But to others, it will seem as though it just popped out of the top of your head. Okay, I'm going to raise my hand and say that basically guidance on advice is always going to be a less straightforward proposition. It always seems a bit idiotic to me to attempt to instruct anyone else on how to have ideas. The best advice I can ever give is just to simply get to work. Starting your research, ponder practical things like the form of media you're going to use to convey your branding messages to your audience. Research some more, edit, and don't forget the incubation process. Just as sure is the advice that when you feel you've hit a brick wall, stop and do something different. Ideally elsewhere. Just get out of your writing space. Some writers on this subject recommend that one thing you can do to improve your ability to have fresher ideas is to get out more, to watch films, look at art, visit all kinds of stimulating cultural phenomenon. In order to feed the brain, this is really good advice. And it's good because it contributes to your general stock of influences and things that you can tap into and draw upon. What I like is understanding of the incubation period of the creative process. And that's, again, where the creative person in question appears to be completely idle. For all intents and purposes, they're not involved at all with the work, but occupied with seemingly mindless pastimes. This not only put me at ease about my own inexplicable interests in surfing and mahjong during what were supposed to be my busy periods, but is also reassuring to all those who suffer blocks or doubts about their ability. There are other techniques for having ideas. Sometimes the very act of reducing unnecessary detail creates the idea. Sometimes creativity is no more than problem solving, but in a way, it's good that some part of the process of having ideas is inscrutable. Find your own way. Many ideas that end up catching the imagination, and from history, many ideas that end up changing the world, start from a moment of apparent idiocy or a naive suggestion. But by their very nature, such ideas are original, so don't be afraid to go there. But it may not have escaped your notice that advertising occasionally lifts ideas from film, art, TV programs, and other fields of creative endeavor. The annoying thing, if you have noticed the phenomenon, is that many of the ads which steal ideas can be very successful or enjoyable, or both. It is usually unfair to accuse people who do this of plagiarism, where it's clearly the intelligent use of cultural references. And where the resultant ads are badly realized, then that's what's wrong. Not the fact that they're using an existing technique or set of characters without attributing the source, it's just that it was badly executed. Part of the job of advertising is to make a link between the brand and an audience. You may recall the two blobs and the X used in the earlier session. Any rule that decrees that everything should be original would wipe out a lot of very good stuff that really relates quite easily to its audience. Nevertheless, Just because it can't be enshrined as a rule doesn't make originality wrong. Much as I defend the apt appropriation of existing ideas, I ultimately prefer originality. The reason isn't anything to do with artistic integrity, but longevity. In the Western canon, Harold Bloom wrote, "One mark of originality that can win canonical status for a literary work is a strangeness that we either never altogether assimilate or becomes such a given that we are blinded to its idiosyncrasies." This is an insight about the world's greatest literature that he will not think before applying to the grubby world of branding, but the point is such a good one that I can't resist. He's saying that great literary works often create something so strange that instead of rejecting them, we do the opposite, and suddenly feel that we can't imagine life without them. They are both strange and commonplace at the same time. This trait is, if anything, a more observable one in branding. Originality is one of the most identifiable characteristics of memorable copy, but at the same time, the very word copywriting reminds us that at the very heart of advertising is the concept of reiteration. You may not have heard that the phrase repetition is reputation. The whole idea of a campaign is to maintain a thought and a tone from previous advertising. Be original doesn't mean being controversial. What I would suggest, though, is to avoid unoriginal execution. So, for example, this is what I mean by that. Commercials that take place in lifts. Why do people keep doing this? Perhaps because a lift journey lasts approximately 30 seconds and is therefore an ideal place to show someone enjoying a chocolate bar or ice cream. Just like there are written and verbal cliches, there are visual cliches, and we've all seen them. Another example, 2 women speaking in a kitchen, or 2 teenagers discussing spots in a bathroom. I suspect that these executional scenarios will still be with us in 1,000 years. However, if there isn't a specific need to place a product or a service in the kitchen or bathroom, then why do so? I, for one, never spoke to my friends about spots and spot creams in a bathroom. In a mall, maybe. In the school cafeteria? Definitely. But a bathroom? No. Did you? Another example would be an engineer's voice interrupting a radio ad. Just because it's postmodern doesn't mean that it hasn't been done before. Yet another one would be headlines for cars that mention head and heart. This is simply a device that should rest in peace. Using phrases like "when it comes to" at the start of copy and start with "so" or "so ... which typically start the last or penultimate line of your copy. This is a very tired way to write copy. It may make life easier for the writer to use these conventional lead-ins and wind-ups, but in a piece of sales material, it's boring and entirely uninspired. Reindeer and Christmas ads. Being creative means you should be able to think of 100 uses of a brick. The same applies to briefs that seem to have no great creative opportunities, such as Christmas ads or Thanksgiving ads. I'm sure you can add more than a few Christmas perennials yourselves, but have faith. There are more Christmas ideas out there waiting to be found. So I heartily advise and encourage all copywriters to find them. Last one, man throwing sticks for a dog. Seen it. Oh, I've seen it. I would add situations such as desert islands, doctor's waiting room, men carrying a pane of glass across a road and queues at bus stops. There's so many more. Even if they haven't been used in ads before, people have seen these so-called comic situations in sketches, sitcoms, and magazine cartoons, so they will still look as tired and dated as a Benny Hill rerun. So this brings us to the end of the lecture for this session. And it's at this point that you can go and tackle both the scenarios and the template that accompany this session. And I look forward to seeing you in session 4.